Hi, everyone. And welcome to the last event of this term. My name is Alexia Lamprakaki, and I am the president of Sussex Scientific Society. And I couldn't be more delighted to be hosting David Sellu as our final guest for tonight's event. I'm not going to narrate a lot on David Sellu, as I'd like him to narrate his story himself, but all I'll say is that David was a consultant colorectal surgeon with a 40-year unblemished career that will today give his talk on medical law, ethics, and regulation. His unblemished career took an unfair turn as a consequence of racial injustice. And I'm just going to quickly run through what is going to happen. First, David is going to give a 45-minute talk on medicine, the law, and its regulations. And at the end, there will be a short 15 to 10-minute Q&A where he'll try to answer some of your questions. So if anyone has any, feel free to type them into the chat box. And with that, I'm just gonna hand over to Dave for his event. So Dave, please open your camera and your microphone and enjoy. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me and see me, Alexia?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, what I'm going to do is to share my screen so that you can see my slides. And then I can start talking from when I show my slides. Okay, can you see that all right? Can you still hear me and see me?
Yes,
see me?
yes, everything's perfect.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Alexia, for inviting me to your meeting today. What I thought I'd talk about is a little bit provocative, and I've entitled my talk, Medicine, the Law and Regulation, Level Playing Fields for BAME Workers. Now, I've chosen the word BAME, as an acronym, which I'm sure you all know, for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. It's a controversial term. In fact, only today in the news, people are saying that we should really drop this term because it just doesn't do justice to the people who are encompassed in this. It lumps everybody all in one, as if we are all one homogeneous group, which we're not. I think each ethnic group has its own characteristics. Nevertheless, nobody has given me a better word to use, so I'll use this acronym for now, because I think we all know what we're talking about. What I thought I'd talk about also is how medicine impinges upon the law and regulation, which I'll talk about later on. And I've asked the question, is it a level playing field for BAME workers? Now, we've heard, of course, that there's been a lot of racism in cricket, for example. And what about our venerable profession of medicine? Is it all racism free? What about gender equality? What about disability? What about equality in terms of sexual orientation? Now, I won't be going into all the rest of these, but I'll concentrate more on race and see how people who work in medicine and also people who are affected by medicine are impinged by medicine, the law, and regulation. Just to say that my story is well known in the medical field, and some of you may well have heard my story, and I've given many talks on this subject before, and some of it is recorded in the media. So if you've heard about it, do forgive me. But I think that this is an important issue, and I think I make no apology for talking about it to various people and various people in different settings. I will be talking about legal events, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm really talking more from the point of view of a clinician, and I have no particular conflicts of interest. Now, I stand here in front of the statue of Nelson Mandela, who is well known worldwide. He was imprisoned unjustly, largely because of his race. And I too, as Alexia has hinted, came into difficulties in medicine after an unblemished career because of race. However, what Mandela did, and I'm not, of course, comparing myself to Nelson Mandela, he was a giant in his own right, but what he did do was to use what happened to him to try and improve life around him. I'm sure it did make a huge amount of difference. And what I'm trying to do is to emulate what Mandela did, to try and see whether by talking about what happened to me, we can improve the scenario in medicine for those who work in it, and of course for our patients, people who use medicine. Now I'm going to do 4 things, which I've summarized on this slide. The first is to tell you about my own personal journey. It's a sad journey, but nevertheless an interesting one, and how it encompassed all 3. In other words, I was a doctor, and I had a problem, and the law impinged upon what I did. And I was also referred to our regulator, the regulator being the General Medical Council, which I'll tell you about a little bit more in just a moment. The next thing I'm going to do is to see how race impacts on medicine. How does race come into medicine? Is medicine race-free? Racism-free? Or are we, in fact, an institutionally racist organization? Now, that may come to many as a surprise because, we all regard medicine as a venerable profession. And what happens when something goes wrong in medicine? The law comes into being and regulation come into being. Are we judged fairly? In other words, if you're white or if you're black and you commit the same, if you have the same problem, does the law affect you similarly? Are you affected by regulation in the same way? Now, these are important lessons because they impinge on patient safety. Everything that happens in medicine is to the either benefit or detriment of the patient, depending on how it happens. And this is an aspect that I just want to very briefly talk about at the end of my talk. So these are the 4 areas that I'm going to be talking about this evening. Now, obviously, many of you are not doctors, and I will therefore, do forgive me if I go through some of the things that happen in medicine. Now, when a problem occurs in medicine, an incident, an adverse event, many things happen. There will be local investigations. So the investigation will take place either in the hospital where it happened or in the GP surgery, as the case may be. The problem may well be resolved at that level, but if it doesn't, it goes on further. If it's a death, it will be investigated by the coroner, and the coroner has very specific remits in the process of investigation: who died, where they died, how they died, when they died, etc. Now, patients and their relatives have a right to take the doctor to a court to get recompense if they think that they've been harmed by medicine. Now, if the incident crosses a certain threshold, the law will come into being, and the law will then investigate. And of course, the highest punishment that the law can provide the individual is, of course, imprisonment. In the case of patients, it's civil litigation, they want money. Now, we also have a regulator, the General Medical Council, GMC, and it has a court arm. The investigatory arm is the Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service. So anything that happens in medicine, any incident, can be reported to the GMC, and the GMC will investigate to see whether the individual, the doctor concerned, has crossed a certain boundary, which brings the profession into disrepute. And if so, they'll offer a number of sanctions. And the most serious of them is, of course, to erase the doctor from the medical register and prevent them from practicing medicine from here on. The public have also got a right to take doctors to task. They can take you to court. The can report the doctors to the General Medical Council. They can report the doctors to the criminal process. So medicine is very carefully regulated in this, as this slide shows. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through it, but this summarizes what happened to me as a practitioner. Now, I will highlight a few aspects of this, but as I say, I will not really go into great detail about it, but only to say that when this incident happened, it took 8 years to resolve. That's how long things sometimes take. So you can imagine that the whole process is very protracted. It destroys the doctor's life. Of course, you know, the patient is also affected, and they're waiting for an answer as to what it was that went wrong. And I was taken off the medical register for a whole 6 years while this was all happening. So it's a very, very difficult process for all concerned. Now, what happened to me was that in 2010, I was working as a consultant colorectal surgeon, specializing in bowel problems in a private hospital in Harrow, just outside London, and a patient died under my care. Now, of course, people die frequently in medicine. It's part of what happens in medical life. This patient was a 66-year-old man. He'd had a knee replacement, and 5 days later, he spontaneously perforated his bowel, and he developed a condition called fecal peritonitis, which is a very serious condition. It kills a third of people who get it, however well treated they are. Now, this was a private hospital, and when something like this happens, they want to distance themselves from that sort of happening, and they threw me into the lion's den, being at the top of the command chain, unfairly, in my view. They got a number of expert witnesses to say that I had done wrong, and so they referred me to the General Medical Council. The General Medical Council is our regulator, and when anything goes wrong in medicine, they oversee what has happened, they investigate, and they offer sanctions as required. The General Medical Council, at my very first referral, said that I'd done nothing wrong, and they said no case to answer. But as you can see here, I was recalled 18 more times. After this, the hospital also referred the case to the coroner. When any death occurs that's not totally explained, the coroner is asked to open an inquest. Because of some expert witness pronouncements, the coroner took it upon himself to say that there was a suspicion of manslaughter, and he referred me to the police. Now, as I say, I don't really want to go into the details of this case because it's very complicated, but I continue to maintain that it was not my fault, and indeed the GMC had determined that previously. However, the coroner is within his right to refer a case to the law, and that's exactly what this coroner did. I had a number of police interviews lasting over 10 hours in 3 sessions, and the whole incident lasted about 48 hours, the time that this patient was under my care. So you can imagine going through investigations lasting 10 hours, something that occurred over 48 hours. It was a very intensive, very painful process. The police decided that there was a case of manslaughter to answer, and therefore referred me to the magistrate's court and ultimately to the Old Bailey, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the highest criminal court in the land. So essentially what they were saying was that I was responsible for this patient's death. And the reason that they felt that they could say this was because they had had a few medical experts who did not rule in my favor, even though the General Medical Council had previously pronounced that I had no case to answer. So they felt obliged to try me in this court. Now, in a court of law, of course, the process is adversarial. The prosecution made out a case, and they use emotionalism very much in front of a jury. Remember, the jury are not medical. they don't really understand medicine, nor do they understand the law. But depending on the way that the prosecution lays out its case, they can make a very strong case against anybody, especially a medical individual. The trial lasted 5.5 weeks, and ultimately the judge gave his summing remarks, and the jury went out for 3 days. They deliberated for 3 days. Normally, juries are able to give an answer on a case in a very short space of time. But because of the complexity of this case, the jury took a lot of time to give an answer. They came back, they handed a piece of paper to the judge and said, "My lord, we don't really understand this case. It's very complicated. There are lots of medical things that we don't really understand." What the judge simply said to them was, "Well, you are the jury. You go, if you decide that he's guilty, then find him guilty," without really giving them adequate direction. The jury went out, having not been able to come to a verdict after 3 days, based on what the judge had simply told them. Be confident. If you find him guilty, say so. Even though they didn't understand, they found me guilty of manslaughter. In effect, what they were saying here is, "My lord, we don't understand the charge, but whatever it is, we are sure he's guilty of it." Now, manslaughter is clearly a serious conviction. It's unlawful killing, and I was sent to prison. I was given a 2.5-year prison sentence. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about just what this means in medical terms later on. But I did go to prison. I went out. I served half of that 2.5 years in some of the most difficult prisons in this country. One of them was Belmarsh, and there were lots of other prisons that I went to serve my sentence. And I came out, and the prison sentence didn't just affect me, it affected my family, it affected my friends. And one of the more sad aspects of my case was my son, James, who at the time was 24 years of age. He just had his he went into medicine. He went into my old medical school, Manchester. He came out, he got his degree. He did an intercalated master's degree, which he also passed. And he was given his first job to go into hospital medicine, to begin as a house officer, what they call the FY Foundation Year 1 studies. He came to me one day and said, "Dad, Mum, my wife, I don't want to go into medicine." And we said, "Well, James, why? You've spent all your life, you spent all your adult life studying to be a doctor. You spent a good quarter of your entire life studying medicine. You've got a student loan of over £80,000 hanging around your neck. Why do you want to get out of medicine?" And James said, "Well, Dad, you spent 40 years of your life given an unblemished career, and one incident, which wasn't even your fault." Even James had worked out that this whole thing was really not my fault. And on account of that one incident, this is what you've been through. If this is what medicine is all about, then it's not for me. James stepped out of medicine. He never went back. He went into business. So this is really a sad conclusion to, well, that wasn't, of course, the end of my case, a sad end to a career that would have been very bright. I'm sure James was a very bright chap. He would have done very well as a doctor, but he was discouraged because of the toxic atmosphere that he sensed existed in medicine. Anyway, at the end of my sentence, my friends, my family thought I'd been done wrong, that this judgment was wrong and that we ought to appeal it, which we did. We took our case to the Royal Courts of Justice and we won the appeal. My conviction was quashed. The judges said that it had been an unfair trial. They should never have brought this case in the first place. Lots and lots of people die in medicine. This is, after all, the end to life. Some people will die because of an incurable disease. Medicine is not a cure-all. And therefore, I had been judged harshly. And so my conviction was overturned. Now, I got no compensation, not that any sort of financial compensation would have made any difference to the hurt that I went through. I got no apology. The coroner had prematurely stopped the inquest when he thought that a crime had been committed. He did not resume the trial. Now, what that meant was that the family didn't really get any kind of answer as to why their loved one died. The hospital had a lot of failings. There were lots of things that the hospital could have done to prevent this man's death. They did not have a number of provisions that were needed. For example, there was no operating theatre. There was no list of anaesthetists who could have helped me when I wanted to operate on this man. And this man's treatment was indeed delayed because of those hospital failings, and they remain uncorrected. The law itself had its reputation tarnished. Remember, this was the Old Bailey. It's the highest criminal court in the land, and it had got my case wrong. So in the end, I lost. The family of the patient lost, and the hospital failings were uncorrected, which means that there are still people coming to this hospital with all these failings still in place. And the law itself had its reputation tarnished because of what? The way that they'd handled this case. So in the end, there were no winners. Now, the General Medical Council recalled me to a final episode of reckoning because they said that they had the right to go through this case all over again in order to see whether the law had missed anything. They tried me for a period of 6 weeks in Manchester, where their court is located. And in the end, they cleared me of all wrongdoing. They said, nothing, you've done nothing wrong. We exonerate you absolutely. We'll restore you back to the medical register. Now, this was me at the end of it all. And I believe that the reason that I'd been singled out for this kind of treatment was primarily because of the color of my skin. Okay, so I talk about the color of my skin. What about working in medicine? What is it about medicine and race? In, I think it was about 2000 and something, I can't really read the date on this journal. It's the British Medical Journal. It's one of the most prestigious journals in medicine. It looked into the whole issue of racism and medicine. And it came into the conclusion that medicine is an institutionally racist organization. It treats those who practice in it unfairly depending on the color of their skin. We know that because if you are from a BAME origin, you struggle in medicine. You struggle, for example, admissions to medical school. We know that people from a white middle class background are given priority for entry into medical school. If you're Black or from an ethnic minority, you struggle to get into medical school. When you get into medicine, recruiting into prestigious jobs is also unfortunately tarnished by race. And there is a very interesting story in the late 1990s of two doctors by the name of Ismail and Sam Everington. They had sensed that there was some racism in the way that people get recruited into jobs. So they tried to test this hypothesis. What they did was they took 100 jobs that came up that were advertised in the medical press. And for each one of those, they created 2 CVs. The 2 CVs were almost identical in the way where the doctor trained, what experience it had, what skills they had, and what their strengths were, looking for this particular job. The only difference in these 2 CVs was the name on top of one was an English sounding name. The name on top of the other was a definitely foreign name, African or Asian or South American or whatever. And they sent out all these applications to all of these jobs to see what happened. And they were not surprised to find that if you had a name not typically English, you were 4 times less likely to be shortlisted for jobs, even though your experience, your training, your skills were exactly similar to the English sounding name. You were less likely to be recruited. And we know that promotion prospects are also hampered if you're not white. So this has been going on in medicine. There are lots of ethnic minority people at the base of the medical ladder, and yet in terms of pay and promotion, they lag behind their white peers. We are underrepresented in management. So at the top table where all the decisions are made, we are underrepresented. Even patients have a poor experience in medicine. If you are a Black woman and you are pregnant and you go into maternity care, you are 4 times more likely to die during childbirth compared to your white counterpart. We know that there are lots of diseases which have an ethnic propensity. You're more likely to suffer diseases because of your race and because of your background, if you're from an ethnic minority, than if you're white. So there are lots of things that are also wrong in medicine. So medicine is not a level playing field in terms of race. And it's not just race, it's also gender, it's also to do with disability, it's to do with sexual orientation. What about the law and regulation? I put these together because they work in a similar way. So when something goes wrong during a doctor's career, they get referred to the regulator, the General Medical Council, and they have their court, the MPTS, which I talked about earlier on, which looks into these events. You are several times more likely to be referred to the GMC and to the MPTS if you are from an ethnic background. You're more likely to be complained about if you are from an ethnic background. You're more likely to be referred to the coroner's court if you're from an ethnic background. And these are all things that will happen in the course of a doctor's life. They are just unavoidable. Unfortunately, they are part of the medical landscape. Why do we need the law and regulation? Well, if you go into a shop and you buy a set of goods, be it a headphone, a car, or whatever it is, you would expect that having paid the money for it, that whatever it is you bought would work. And there are lots of laws to protect your rights in that regard. I think similarly, you'd expect, therefore, that if you go into a hospital as a patient, you have rights. You have the right to the very best that medicine can offer. But unfortunately, we know that, as I was saying, as a patient, you often struggle when you come across the behemoth that is medicine. So it's not just doctors that come across medicine as being a difficult field. Even patients do have difficulty when they bring their complaints to medicine. And I've also talked about the disproportionate referrals of doctors to the law and to the regulator. These things take a very long time, and ultimately they undermine patient safety. So why does it all matter? Why is it important that there is a level playing field where race is concerned for everybody? Well, if you've got a properly functioning field, i.e. the people who are working in it are treated equally, then your patients are going to be safer at the end. Now, I put this slide up. It's really to illustrate a point. Now, imagine that this is the M25, a busy motorway. It's winter, it's been snowing, and the road is poorly lit, and there's a sharp bend on this road, and an accident occurs because the person at the front of the queue was driving safely, but because of road conditions being poor, this individual hits the central reservation and then causes, or as a consequence of hitting the central reservation coming to a stop, 20 other cars concertina into him, and there's a multiple crash at the, behind him. Now imagine that the police officers come along, they drag him out of the car and they say, it's all your fault. You caused 20 deaths as a consequence of your hitting that central reservation. Well, that individual says, well, hang on, the road was poorly lit, the road has not been properly gritted, the road conditions are poor, it wasn't my fault. And they say, no, it was your fault, we'll put you into prison, therefore problem sorted. Well, the problem's not really been sorted. What about all those people that were driving so close to him, who went into him, who caused the major crash on the motorway? Aren't you going to take those into account? What about the fact that the road wasn't properly gritted? What about the fact that there was poor road lighting? Well, we've got the individual at the front, which is similar to what happened to me. We're not going to correct all the background factors. So what you're leaving behind is a potential accident black spot. And unfortunately, strange though this may sound, this is how things happen in medicine today. Medicine does not look at itself inwards into itself to try and correct some of the problems that are there, the lack of funding, the lack of provision of adequate equipment, lack of adequate training, etc. And when something goes wrong, they take out one individual and they blame that individual. Now, as a consequence of that approach, there have been several major medical scandals, simply because we are underfunding the profession, we are not providing adequate training, not providing the sort of supervision that's really needed. Now, time does not allow me to go into all of these, but you will have read about some of these. For example, one of the most famous was Mid Staffordshire, where the whole system was so dysfunctional. Patients were lying in their own excrement and people not caring about them. People were being denied water, people were being denied food, people were being denied adequate care. In short, most of the care actually broke down, and this was reported to the government. The government set up an inquiry, and this inquiry came up with a number of recommendations which were passed on as ways in which to improve standards of medical care. But that wasn't the end of it. We've had similar sorts of breakdowns in medical care in hospitals in Furness, part of the Morecambe Bay group of hospitals. There have been other incidents in Shrewsbury and Telford and so on. In other words, because the government is not tackling things at institutional level, rather blaming individuals when things go wrong, unfortunately, medicine is not really going to be correcting some of the ills that occur because of this approach. Can we do better? Well, if we look at safety-conscious industries like aviation, they were where we are now 20, 30, 40 years ago. Aviation had a similar approach. They blamed individuals when things went wrong, and sadly, their processes were not sorted, and this sort of thing happened. When an aviation incident happens, it's often catastrophic. The air crew also die with their passengers. There's enormous damage to aircraft. This, one aircraft may be worth nearly £500 million. There may be even collateral damage. When an incident occurred in Scotland once, many, many years ago, an aircraft fell upon a sleepy village on the west coast of Scotland and actually killed 11 people who were sleeping in their own beds, in their own homes, who had nothing to do with aviation. In short, aviation recognized that when things do go wrong, they go catastrophically wrong. What they did was they took a completely different approach to what medicine is doing. What they do is when something does go wrong, of course, when things go wrong, you're not just going to let people go scot-free. People have to be held to account for their mistakes and for things that they do wrong. But when they mean to do no wrong, it's simply because the system around them has failed. What they do is they give their workers safe spaces to come and report errors. So if something's gone wrong, people are allowed, instead of putting them in the kind of adversarial situation that medicine does, they put them in a safe space to say, okay, what was it that really went wrong? Tell us all that did go wrong. What lessons can we learn? How can we disseminate those lessons to other people who work in your area to make sure that we all learn lessons and things go better in the near future? Aviation even said to people, if you made a mistake that didn't cause the death or didn't cause any harm, but that could have caused harm, come and tell us about it. We won't punish you. We won't hold you to any sort of ransom. We will simply make sure that we all learn the lessons of what has happened so that we can make the whole scenario safer, so that everybody can learn. And this is what they've done in aviation. Aviation, from being the sort of area where this sort of thing happened to, sorry, let me just go back. From being the area where this sort of thing happened, has now become so safe that it's now said that you're more likely to die in the taxi that takes you to the airport than in an aviation accident. It is now one of the safest ways of traveling. And they've managed to surmount all the difficulties that we've been talking about to make aviation a very, very safe experience. Sure, they lose your luggage. Airports are not the most comfortable places to be in, but nevertheless, it's a very safe way of traveling. So my take-home messages really are the following: that we've got to eliminate racism in medicine, we've got to eliminate racism in the law, and we've got to eliminate racism in regulation if we are going to make the landscape safer for our patients in the end. It's now been shown that criminalizing medical incidents does not make patients safe, because all that doctors do is they do things to protect themselves in the future. So if a doctor is now faced with a scenario where things might be reported, all they do is they try and cover their own backs. They do too many tests. They do too many investigations. They do too many unnecessary operations that are in the end not really in the best interest of the patient, simply because they want to prove to cover their own backs, so that if they are reported, they can say, well, I did all that I had to do. And I think the mantra really has to be to learn and not to blame. So many thanks. It's been a very painful journey for me, but I'm back now in medical practice. I'm not working as avidly as I used to, but I do enjoy being a doctor, and particularly being a surgeon. And I have a lot of people to thank for taking me through this journey. Doctor called Jenny Vaughan, who was one of the people that led my appeal, and my legal teams and the Medical Protection Society. Now, I've written about my experience, which I have not had time to go into in any great detail, and it's now available online. If anybody wants to buy a signed copy, if you talk to Alexia, and I'm sure she'll be able to put you through how I can get you copies of my book. So Sussex Society, thank you very much for a scientific society. Thank you very much for giving me the privilege of talking to you this evening. I'll stop there and I'll open the floor for discussion. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you so much. I think it was pretty much our privilege to host you on the Sussex Scientific Society today. I have to say that it was an incredible talk from your part, and we couldn't be more delighted to hear your story and to raise awareness in those kinds of issues concerning race in medicine. And I actually have some questions of my own. So I'm curious. So you were a victim of racial injustice, and as a BAME worker in this particular hospital, I have to ask, was this a rare incident, or had you seen similar things happen as well?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. No, it's not rare. It's reckoned that probably 20,000 people die unnecessarily in medical care in this country every year. Now, these figures are obviously very difficult to come by because it's often very difficult to investigate cases and to say, well, this person died because of inadequate medical care, etc., etc. Now, as you've seen from the verdicts that came out of my case, I didn't do anything wrong because I'd been through the law, I'd been through the medical regulator, and they all cleared me. However, things do go wrong in medicine, and it's reckoned that probably 20,000 patients die every year. Now, we can't investigate all of them, but we can investigate some of the more prominent ones. And sadly, mine wasn't really one that might have stood out as one that should have been flagged for investigation. But this, unfortunately, is what happens. Yes, more people from Black and ethnic minorities get reported when these sorts of incidents happen. More people get reported when any sort of incident happens. And this is a fact, and this has been completely investigated. There was a report done about 5 years ago looking at what the reasons might be why people from BAME backgrounds are reported more frequently to the regulator and to the law. And some of those reasons we still don't yet understand, but I think it must be obviously because of the color of our skin, because if you work alongside a white colleague and say you make the same mistakes for the sake of argument, how is it that you are more likely to be referred for these mistakes than your white colleague? This, unfortunately, is a fact. So it is very common, unfortunately. It's not rare.
I understand. Was this racial injustice investigated further for you? Was it judged upon that? Or was it just left as a case of a mistake?
Well, the law, sadly, has been accused of racial injustice for a very long time. It's not just doctors. Yeah. We know that if you are from an ethnic minority, just as an ordinary member of the public, you are more likely to find yourself in front of the law than if you are from a white background. If you present to the courts for a misdemeanor, you are more likely to be prosecuted for that misdemeanor. If you're prosecuted, you're more likely to get a tougher sanction if you are from a BAME background. This is fact. We know this. This happens in ordinary society. We would have hoped that in medicine, things would be different. Unfortunately, things are not different. No, my case was not investigated because the law does not recognize that it's racist. It's been pointed out many, many times. Even the General Medical Council does not recognize that it's racist. Medicine is still denying racism, even though this has now been fully investigated. I mean, the British Medical Journal wrote a series of articles pointing out with figures. These are not just people standing up and saying, you are racist, medicine, and so on. We've actually got figures to prove that medicine is racist. We know from the figures and facts If you're working alongside a white colleague, you're more likely to get less money for doing the same job than your white colleague. So these are all things that happen on a daily basis. This is not playing the race card.
Yeah.
These, unfortunately, are facts of life for those who work in the profession.
Yeah, and it is sad, and I do agree. What can I say? So we have a question from the crowd, actually, and it's a pretty lengthy one, if you will. So Mo says, you mentioned the change in aviation approach to creating safe spaces. For many areas in medicine where there are problems, this is an excellent way to make progress. However, it can be counterproductive to areas where hospitals claim to have zero tolerance, for example, over bigotry, racism, or harassment. Despite claiming zero tolerance, many of complaints regarding equity go unresolved. What changes do you think the medical system needs to address these types of problems?
Okay, that's a very long, very lengthy question. It's complicated, but let me put it to. Sorry, who was the questioner?
I'm sorry.
Who
questioned? Oh, Mo.
Oh, okay. There are two aspects really. Let's split it into two domains. First of all, people working in medicine obviously expect to be treated equally, whatever their race. Unfortunately, we know that yes, there is talk of a zero tolerance, but that's just rhetoric. I think when it comes to the actual practicalities, what happens in practice is completely different from the rhetoric, sadly. Equally, I think if you are also from an ethnic minority and you've been harmed as a patient, as a relative, as somebody coming in from the outside, and you raise your complaints, sadly, it's also recognized that you will be treated differently depending on the color of your skin. We know this because we've seen people coming in to complain who come from an ethnic background, and their complaints are less likely to be taken seriously than people who are white. Now, we bring in the case of aviation because I think this is really the way that medicine should be heading. You know, aviation had a zero tolerance to things going wrong. But for many years, airplanes were crashing out of the skies because of systems failures, because of design failures and so on. It's only when aviation sort of sat back and said, let's go down to first principles. Let's listen to those who work in it. Let's try not to impose sanctions. Let's try not to be judgmental in the way that we've been up to now. Let's give people safe spaces. See what difference it makes. And boy, what difference has that made? If at the end of all of this, we're really going to be solving we're going to want to solve problems in medicine in terms of the amount of harm that's caused, the number of people who die unnecessarily, then I think we've got to be mature enough to do what aviation did and stop the blame culture and really look into a more learning system and fix systemic problems in the way that aviation has done. In the end, that is what's going to be of benefit to A, people who work in medicine, and B, people, especially our patients, who we have a duty to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. Do you think aviation is now a structure that implements like a better system in dealing with those kinds of problems? Or do you think that overall there have been no very major improvements towards racial injustice?
Well, I don't know about racial problems in aviation, but I think there were lots and lots of issues in aviation to begin with. I mean, there was a time when every time you turned on the television, every few days, there was an airline incident in which people died.
Yeah.
When you consider the number of people who now use aviation as a means of travel, it's actually safer to travel on an airplane than it is to travel by car. We know that 10 people die every day on the roads in England. that is what, about 365 days a year, 3,600 people die every year from accidents on the roads. Now, if that number of people were dying that's the equivalent of 10 air crashes a year. Now, you don't hear about it because it happens quietly and it doesn't even get reported and so on. But aviation is, surmounted these problems. There may, of course, be problems in relation to race relations, etc. But I think at the end of the day, what we want to do is to make medicine safer for people who work in it and people who use it, i.e. our patients. And if we're going to be carrying on with the sort of attitude that we are, i.e. the blame culture is really what this is all about. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got to adopt the kinds of procedures that happened in aviation. Of course, I can't speak for aviation in terms of race relations, but I think what they have done, which has been admirable, is how they've managed to get over the sorts of problems that we used to see 20, 30, 40 years ago in terms of aviation safety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think there is such an example regarding race within medicine, like a system that has improved lately towards racial injustice in medicine? Or do you think it has not improved at all?
We are still working on it. I think it's by talks such as this one that you've allowed me, or you've given me the privilege to take part in, that we're going to be telling others about it. We'll tell people who are working in the biomedical field. After all, you are all going to be contributing to medicine in one way or another. Medicine is not just about doctors and nurses. Medicine is about the people who work in our laboratories, who provide us with the tools that we use for the trade, the people who clean our floors in medicine, the people who stand guard at our hospital gates, the people who work in our car parks and so on. And I think we tend to forget that, we need the participation of a wide range of people in order to make medicine safe. And therefore, I think this isn't just something that affects, doctors and nurses. It's something that affects a much, much wider group of people. And unfortunately, we're not really making inroads. But I think it's by having meetings such as this one, where we make people like yourselves more aware of these issues, so that when you go into, when you finish your degrees and you take your jobs in whatever field, obviously you are going to be impinging on the medical field. You bring your own experience. You would have listened to a talk such as this. You'd have been given the opportunity to think about race. And I think by being aware and also by highlighting the problem, I think we can all fight this problem. And also, just to mention that this is not just a problem for BAME people. It's also for even white people, I think, have a role in this. Because at the end of it all, we all need to play a part in producing safety for our patients. If you take away all BAME workers today, the service will collapse. Medicine will not work unless you have a full capacity of people from very rich backgrounds giving an input into medicine. So I think it's in our total interest, all of us, collective interest, as practitioners, whether we're white or whether we're from a BAME background, to really ensure that we get rid of racism in medicine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I would like to move a little bit from this subject, because we have a question regarding the legality of those actions. And I would just like to ask, so Mo asks, where do you think the cutoff should lie between whether a doctor is allowed to train/practice or is suspended for the duration of an investigation?
Okay, that's a very good question. I'm not defending every doctor, every practitioner in medicine. Unfortunately, there will be people who mean to cause harm. And there have been plenty of examples of those. They're not many. Harold Shipman, for example, was a doctor who went about killing. We know that he probably killed over 1,000 patients. Why he did that deliberately, we will never know. There was a nurse called Beverly Allett who went about injecting toxic substances into babies' drips, and she actually killed 3 babies that we know about. She might have killed many more. And there are several examples of people who go into medicine and nursing and healthcare wanting to cause harm. There is no place for people like that. Equally, there are people who, on the other side of the coin, there are people who wake up in the morning wanting to do harm, wanting to do no harm, wanting to do the very best for their patients, but for one reason or another, they find themselves in dysfunctional organizations. Now, to hold those people responsible, rather than to fix the problem in the base organization, I think is wrong. But there is room for improvement. People should be encouraged to go and train better. If they're not doing well, they shouldn't be allowed to practice. And that's what the General Medical Council, one of the functions of the GMC, is all about, that it will weed out those people who are not pulling their weight. So what I'm not suggesting for one moment that everybody who goes into the healthcare field should be allowed to practice unhampered. No, there should be regulation. There should be correct regulation in the interest of the patients that we serve, that only people who are properly qualified, people who are properly skilled, who are properly accredited to do the job, do the job. If there are people who are not fully trained, who are not properly accredited, who are not properly motivated to do the job, then they shouldn't be in healthcare. So we're not making a case for everybody to be allowed to go into medicine and practice willy-nilly. I think there should be regulation to ensure that only the right people with the right qualification, the right temperament are allowed to go into medicine. So that I think, I hope emphasizes that issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So say that someone had committed such a crime nowadays, and you addressed blame culture should stop being so prominent regarding legal action. But if someone was suspected to have committed a crime, how do you think it should be dealt legally with having the patient's best interest at heart?
Well, the patient's best interest is always, and I make no apology for this, even though despite what I've been through, in fact, I am a champion for patients' rights. It's the patient that is at the top end of the whole pinnacle, at the end of it all. That's who we all work for. And if there is anyone whatsoever that comes into this with this express aim of harming patients, they should be stopped. And if they do cause harm, they should be prosecuted and punished. And there are lots and lots of laws that we now have in our armamentarium. Grievous bodily harm. There was a surgeon not so long ago who went about mutilating patients. For the sake of financial gain, he was doing unnecessary operations and charging people in the private sector for doing these sorts of mutilations.
Wow.
So there will always be, in every walk of life, whether it be in medicine, whether it be in the biomedical sciences, whether it be in acting or whatever, there will always be people who go in with the aim of causing harm. And those people should not be tolerated. There is no place for them at all. And there are laws that weed out those people. I think the problem that happens in medicine is that they failed sometimes to differentiate between people who find themselves working in a dysfunctional system through no fault of their own, and people who deliberately go into the system wanting to cause harm. And I think, with the right sort of approach, we should have a system, we do have a system that should distinguish those two types of people. The problem is we're not really doing it very well. That's the reason that people like myself, fall into the sort of through the kind of net that is there. There are laws, and there should correctly be laws to protect patients' rights. And I think patients deserve to be protected in medical settings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you very much for this answer. And I would just like to thank you for giving us this talk one more time. Unfortunately, this is all the time we've had today. So we've come to the end of our event, unfortunately, for tonight. But I would just like to say a great thank you to everyone that's been attending our events lately. And we'll come back next term with even more content for everyone. But thank you again for this term, and we will be back next term with talks as interesting, I hope, as this one. So thank you, everyone. Merry Christmas. And make sure to be updated through our social media pages and through our YouTube channel if you subscribe. And we'll come back for more. And thank you very much, David, and thank you very much to everyone that attended. And with that, this is the end of our event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for